everybody would call.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. May we see it? I'm ready to proceed.
Yes, Jen.
And call your next witness.
Doug Robinson.
Doug Robinson. Sir, do you swear or affirm testimony you give here today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, sir?
I do.
If someone else, you have a witness stand, be careful with this. May I?
Thank you. Can you tell us your name?
My name is Doug Robinson. I am Special Agent with the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the acronym is ATF. I've still been employed for approximately 31 years.
Okay. And tell us what a special agent with the ATF does.
My responsibilities are to enforce federal firearms, narcotics, arson, explosives laws, and that is to include firearms trafficking, illegal possession of firearms, and firearms used during the commission of drug trafficking crimes and/or firearms used in crimes of violence.
And you said you worked for the ATF for 31 years, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about your career?
I've started out in Chicago, was on the DEA task force up there, spent 5 years up there, detailed to Miami, was down there for 6 to 8 months, detailed to West Virginia, came back to Indianapolis for 6 years, been back in Lexington now since 1999. My primary caseload has been drugs and gun cases. And I've worked some arson and explosive cases as well. Generally, at least at a minimum over 500 cases involving drug trafficking, firearms trafficking, and drug trafficking with firearms.
Okay. And in your career, do you, does the ATF attempt to purchase firearms off the street? I guess, is that a good way to say that?
Yes, we do.
Okay. And were you doing investigations trying to get firearms off the street in 2014?
I was.
And you said you've been doing that for 31 years?
That's correct.
Okay. Let's talk, can you tell us a little bit about the investigations you were doing specifically in 2014, that summer, up until like September?
During the course of that year, I was the lead investigator, investigating illegal illicit gun trafficking within the city of Lexington. Also included a conspiracy to traffic guns, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. The case that she is referring to was a large-scale conspiracy case where we had approximately 33 defendants that were federally indicted. The case lasted approximately 2 years.
Okay. And how long did that go on? What 2-year time span was that?
We started it in early 2014, and I think it lasted up through 2015, toward the end of 2015, as far as court time, things like that.
And would that include getting stolen guns off of the street?
Yes, it would.
Okay. In your training and experience, do you find that stolen guns change hands multiple times?
Based on my training and experience, gun traffickers who traffic in guns illegally generally get their guns from flea markets, get their guns from other people on the street. A lot of times those guns may or may not be stolen, and those guns will then be sold to another person who may then sell it to another person, which makes it difficult for us as investigators to trace those guns because there's no paperwork done when it comes to illegal and illicit gun trafficking. But multiple hands, the guns do change to multiple hands many times, especially stolen guns, guns that people know are stolen, trying to put money and get rid of it.
Okay. And we were talking about this large-scale investigation you were doing in 2014. Did that investigation involve someone named Antonio Fry?
It did.
All right. And did you purchase multiple guns from that particular person during that period of time in 2014?
Yes, we did. We did purchase multiple firearms from Mr. Frank.
Okay. I want to talk about something that occurred on September 2nd, 2014. Were you aware that Mr. Fry was selling a firearm on that date?
I was.
Okay. Can you tell us about that, please?
We had contact with one of our confidential informants, and that informant advised that Mr. Fry had texted him and advised him that he had a 45 caliber firearm for sale.
And before you, I don't mean to stop you, but can you explain to the jury what a confidential informant is?
Confidential informant is someone who's registered by us, who goes through a process of registration. That person then is provided a number, so whenever we identify him or her or any information that they may provide us, it's identified with that number. The name is not used.
Okay, and I'm sorry I interrupted you, go ahead. I think you were talking about how you became aware of Antonio Fry and the CI.
The text messages that our CI had received from Mr. Fry, and again, the CI knew Mr. Fry. We had already purchased guns from Mr. Fry, but at that point in time on that day, that he had a .45 caliber for sale for $350.
Okay. Did you arrange for a buy to occur between the CI and Mr. Fry?
We did. We did what's called a controlled buy. We meet with our CI. We search the CI. We search his vehicle. We provide the CI with, we equip him with recording devices. We provide him with official funds, make the purchase. Then once he is in his or her vehicle, we will follow them to the predestined location where the buy is supposed to occur, which is what we did on that day.
Okay, and tell us about how much was the CI supposed to buy this gun for?
The CI was supposed to spend $350 to purchase a .45 caliber firearm, which he did. In addition, once the buy is done, the CI is then followed to a location that's predetermined by us. We will meet the CI, we will search him again, we will search his vehicle again, and take custody of the evidence, which in this case was a .45 caliber firearm, and the recording devices.
Okay. And do you also watch this happen, the interaction between the CI and the person who's selling the gun?
Yeah, we do our best to be able to visually see what's going on. Sometimes we're unable to do that because of the location. Sometimes buys occur inside residences where we can't see, obviously. But we do our best to be able to visually see our CI. That's protection and for identification later down the road.
And did you do that in this case?
On this particular day with this buy, we did.
Okay, and tell us about that.
The CI parked on Nelson Avenue, and myself and Special Agent Hoover parked approximately 40 yards from where the CI was parked and observed at that time an individual that we knew to be Mr. Antonio Fry enter the CI's vehicle.
Okay. And did he get back out of the vehicle?
The vehicle moved about 10-15 feet on Nelson. After a few minutes then, Mr. Fry exited the vehicle and walked back to a residence there on Nelson.
Okay. And you said that you searched the CI and the vehicle before the buy occurs?
That's correct.
Is that to verify that the evidence that you're going to be getting, in this case a gun, is not already there?
It's correct. It sterilizes the situation and makes it obviously more accountability, and obviously to verify that we're sure that there's nothing else in there before, during, and after.
Do you know what time this sale occurred?
5 o'clock correctly. I want to say it was around 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
Okay. And after the sale took place, what did you do?
We met with the CI. We took possession of the evidence, obviously searched the CI and the CI vehicle, took possession of the recording equipment, and debriefed the CI, and then we took the evidence back to our office where we processed and logged our electronic surveillance evidence, which is the video and the firearm itself.
Okay. And did you get a chance to look at the firearm in this case?
Yes.
What did you do with it?
We processed it, we put it into our evidence, and we run the serial number to check and see if the gun is stolen. In this case it was. It had been reported stolen to the Lexington Police Department. We knob test the firearm, fire a couple rounds through it to get the shell casings.
What does that mean, knob and test?
Knob test is where we will take shell casings or ammo, and we will fire the ammo through the firearm. We will take two shell casings and we will send them to our Nibin lab, which enters them into a large database of other firearms and or shell casings. And what that does is that down the road, if you have a firearm that you have purchased or taken custody of, and you have the ballistics on that, down the road, you may have a crime that occurs in another city where they recover a gun, or they recover shell casings, and they will do the same thing, and then a lot of times that will match up with that crime. And in the sense of, gives us more leads to follow. It doesn't mean that that person that we bought the gun from committed that crime, but it will give us leads as to what happened at the other location.
Okay. And do you remember which gun you purchased in this case?
It was a Springfield Armory .45 caliber.
Okay. And whenever you received that gun, did you make a note of the serial number of that gun?
Yes,
And did you also take photos of the gun?
yes.
Doesn't matter. Special Agent Robinson, I'm going to show you what's been marked as Commonwealth Exhibits 63 and 64. Do you recognize those?
That would appear to be the firearm that we purchased on September the 2nd, 2014, during a controlled purchase with Antonio Fry.
Okay, and may I see the one that you're holding in your left hand? Going to publish this to the jury. And is this the firearm you were just referring to?
That is correct.
Okay. And now I'm going to show you Commonwealth Exhibit 63. Can you tell the jury what that is?
That's the serial number for the Springfield Armory firearm, .45 caliber, that was purchased on September 2nd from Mr. Antonio Fry.
All right. Now, were you aware that the Lexington Police Department was looking for this firearm?
No,
Okay. At the time you purchased it?
no, we were not.
All right. After you received this firearm, what did you do with it?
We put it into our evidence, and we received a call from the Lexington Police Department that the firearm that we had purchased may have been involved in a crime, that being the homicide that occurred at the Austin Saloon. At that point in time, after doing the things that we needed to do, we turned the firearm over to the Lexington Police Department for further testing with regards to their investigation.
Do you know what date that occurred?
September the 4th. I think that was the date we turned it over.
All right. And in your training experience, in a situation where someone sells a firearm that is stolen, is that person who is selling it necessarily the person who stole the gun or committed a crime with that gun?
Not necessarily.
Do firearms change hands frequently when they're stolen?
They do. A lot of times, hot guns, most
What does that mean?
guns that are stolen, generally folks that steal the guns know that they have to get rid of them quickly. They don't want to get caught with a stolen gun, so they will move it as fast as possible. Sometimes they have people waiting to buy the firearms to resell them. It's a big market.
Okay. And I'm going to show you what's been marked as Commonwealth Exhibits 65 and 66, and then ask you some questions about those when we review those. During the course of this investigation, did you become familiar with Antonio Fry?
I did.
And do you know what he looks like in 2014?
I did.
Okay. Can you tell us, how would you describe him?
Heavy set, approximately 6'1", 6'2", 220, 230 pounds, short hair, light skin.
Okay. I'm going to take these photos from you. I'm going to show you what's been marked as Commonwealth Exhibit 65. Do you recognize the individual in the photo in the red shirt, the male?
That's Mr. Antonio Fry, individual that we purchased the firearm from, the Springfield Armory .45 on September the 2nd.
Okay. And I'm going to show you one more photo. This is Commonwealth Exhibit 66. And who's the gentleman in that photo?
Again, that's Mr. Antonio Fry, same individual that we purchased the firearm, .45 caliber, Springfield Armory. Purchased that gun from him on September the 2nd.
And is this what he looked like during that period of time when you were buying firearms from him?
Yes, that would appear to be so, yes.
Okay, and you didn't just buy the one firearm in September, you bought multiple?
Correct, we bought multiple firearms.
Okay, do you know how long that occurred?
I want to say it was a 2-month period. No, multiple purchases.
And Judge, at this time, I would move to introduce photo or Commonwealth Exhibits 63, 64, 65, and 66. That's all the questions I have, Judge.
Special Agent, you said you were purchasing guns off Mr. Fry for somewhere around 2 months.
Roughly, we had multiple defendants, Mr. Fry was one of those.
Right, you had mentioned 33 people were federally indicted.
That's correct.
Okay. Not Mr. Canada,
No,
and not Mr. Molassen.
no.
Okay. This 2-month time period that you're buying guns from Mr. Fry, did this gun purchase occur towards the end, towards the beginning, somewhere in the middle?
I can't recall. I can't recall. My guess is that since it was in September, probably toward the end. Yeah, because we went from different defendants, we had multiple CIs, so we had different eyes going on at different times.
Okay. And eventually you arrested him, right?
Eventually we did.
Okay. Do you know when that was?
I do not remember the date.
Okay. Before this gun purchase, do you remember when the last gun you had purchased from him was? It sounds like this was not the first gun purchased from him.
It was not.
Okay. So do you remember how long it had been since a gun had been purchased from him until September 2nd when you purchased this gun? Was it a week before, 2 weeks before, do you know?
I can't recall, but I do recall that the length of time when we purchased guns from Mr. Fry was in between buys, was roughly a couple of weeks.
Roughly a couple of weeks?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. And just told the Commonwealth that if you buy a gun from somebody and that gun is suspected to be used in some other crime, it's not necessarily the person you bought that gun from was the person that committed that other crime, right?
That's correct.
I'm sure through 31 years you have had that situation come up though, where the person you bought the gun from was the person that used it in that crime.
Maybe a handful of times.
Maybe a handful of times.
Yeah.
So it can happen. It's not mutually exclusive. Right?
Correct, it can.
Okay. And for Mr. Fry, there was no follow-up about Austin City or where this gun came from.
I don't know about Lexington's investigation, so I can't answer that. I can tell you that we on our end, our protocols, we traced the gun, which we did in this case, and at that point, turned the gun over to them. Because obviously their homicide case was their case, and it wasn't ours, so I can't answer that.
And when you say trace the gun, you mean put the serial number in, see what the computer says about the origins of that gun, and follow up if it comes back stolen or something?
Well, no, the stolen check is based on NCIC, which is the National Crime Information Database. The ATF traces guns, and during the course of that trace, we put in all the information, and then people at our tracing center have to manually call the manufacturer, from the manufacturer down to the distributor down to who it goes to, and eventually to the gun store.
Okay.
And the gun store then says, yes, we received that gun, and this is who purchased it.
Okay, so there we go. I'm glad I asked. Your tracing is actually talking about from manufacturing down to point of sale. Okay, you did that.
That's right.
All right. And this is the gun right here, right?
That's correct, if that's the same picture she showed me.
Right, it is. How familiar are you with Springfield armories?
With regards to,
Are you aware they come in a version where the barrel is steel and not black, or silver looking and not black?
I'm not aware of that with Springfield, but I'm not surprised, because a lot of manufacturers do that.
Okay, so you're not aware personally, but it would surprise you. All right. That's all I have to. Do you want to get back or do you put them
Agent Robinson, on how many occasions did you see Mr. Fry?
to include surveillance and other purchases of other evidence, at least 12 to 15.
Did you ever see him wearing his hair in dress?
No,
Okay. Do you know if any of that surveillance was conducted in June of 2014?
I would have to look forward to that now.
Okay. In September of 2014, when you saw him in the incident you described for the jury, he was wearing a hat, right?
Correct.
Red shorts, red shirt, tan shorts, and a hat?
Yeah, I think that's my description. Baseball cap, yes.
A baseball cap. Did you happen to know the color of the baseball cap or anything?
If I recall correctly, I want to say it was white.
Okay. Person approach line. I've handed you another photograph of Antonio Fry, right?
But yes, it appears to be him.
Okay. And you said you've seen him a number of times. You saw those other photos of him today. This is another photo of him. Okay. Permission to publish an jury. I do, back there. You told us that you believe Mr. Fry to be 6'1"?
Yeah, I think it was 6'1" or 6'2", and I based that on the fact that when I arrested him, he was taller than me, and I'm about 5'11" and a half.
Okay. So he's taller than 5'11" and a half?
That's correct.
Okay. That's all I have now. That's what we need to the eight I just have a couple of redirect questions then. How many, I don't even know if you, can you make a guess as to how many buys, controlled buys you have done over the years? Over 31 years.
More than 500.
Okay. And I think, I don't know if I'm saying this correctly, but I think Mr. Tracy asked you, correct me if I'm wrong, if the person who committed the crime or stole the firearm has ever sold it before, and you said that's happened a handful of times?
Yes,
I'm correct about that. Okay, so over 500 buys, but that's happened,
that's correct.
and this is 500 firearms buys.
Firearms and/or other evidence related to violent crimes.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
So, very few times over the course of your career has it happened that way. Now, let's take it 1 degree out, where it's been proven later that the person selling the gun got it from the person that did this other crime that the gun was in. I'd imagine that's happened more than a handful.
Rephrase that, or give me that again.
Sure thing. So Commonwealth's talking about when you buy the gun from the person, the gun's educated in something else, and the person ends up being the one that did the other thing. You said that's a handful of times over your career.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm talking about where, and maybe it's not proven too often, I don't know, but where we still have the gun seller, okay? The people that I guess you guys interact with. And then it's shown that that gun came from a person to that person directly, what I call 1 degree of separation.
Mm-hmm.
And that person is the person that was later found to be the criminal in whatever crime that the gun was involved in.
You know, I still have to say a handful, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that if the buyer, that person selling us the gun, doesn't cooperate with us and tell us where he got the gun, then we're just out of luck. Because the majority of guns that we buy and trace, we end up having to do what's called a backwards trace, where you have to start with where you got it, who that person got it from, and then you go find them, and then who that person got it from. And a lot of times, they're in that chain, people don't want to say anything, I don't remember,
Sure.
or, I don't know.
Sure.
So I'm gonna have to stay with a handful of times.
Okay. And so, like you said, a lot of people, they don't want to say anything. They get caught with stolen guns, selling it to you guys arrest them, they don't say anything. They're done.
Or I didn't know it was stolen.
Right. Now, in this case, you didn't ask that, though.
We couldn't because he wasn't under, we didn't arrest him at that point in time. We arrested him later and didn't ask him.
You did ask.
Yes.
Okay. I thought you just testified that you did your trace and then gave it to the cops here and whatever they did.
Well, upon his arrest, we asked him if he wanted to cooperate. He said no.
Okay. But you can't remember when you arrested.
No, I can't, because it was a large scale arrest, and I just can't remember.
Okay.
I can look it up.
So, this particular gun, this particular purchase of this particular gun, it sounds like you're saying he contacted the CI, and he said, I got a gun for sale.
That's correct.
So this was something that was set up kind of out of the opportunity that he brought to your CI.
That's right. That's correct. As he had done previously.
Okay. As he had done. Okay. And that was within some number of days of the actual purchase? Either day of or day before?
Are you talking about the actual purchase on the trace?
I'm talking about the purchase on September the 2nd
Okay.
by the CI.
Mhm.
It was some number of days before that Mr. Fry had texted the CI and said, I got this 45 to sell for $350.
One minute.
One day. Okay. So, anytime in July, Mr. Fry never said anything about this gun to y'all?
No, I mean, we were selling, he was selling other guns. That's not that one.
Sure. And then August 2, didn't say anything about it in August. It was September 1st, he said, I have a 45, I'm selling it for $350, and you guys said it.
That's right.
Okay, nothing further.
Agent, you were describing that backward trace to Mr. Tracy. I imagine sometimes that ends up going back years to find the lawful owner of the gun.
We usually don't make it that far.
You usually don't make it that far. But those traces can go back months.
They can. Depending on if people cooperate. In other words, if I buy a gun from you today and I trace it, it comes back to John Doe, who bought it 6 months ago, I have to ask you, where did you get the gun? And you say, I got it from, Big Lou. And here's Big Lou's address. And I go to Big Lou and I say, did you have this gun? Did you sell it to so-and-so? They may say no, or yes, or I don't remember. If that's the case, it stops there.
And
We
that,
have no further, nowhere else to go.
that example you gave where you're trying to cover 6 months at a time, that's a pretty typical situation.
Well, cover 6 months at a time. Generally, we will trace guns that have been purchased 5 years ago. And they got sold at a gun show or at a yard sale or wherever. And then usually the first or second backwards interview that you hit, that's where it stops.
Because people stop cooperating.
Well, that or they don't remember, or they just don't want to talk. It doesn't mean they've done anything illegal. It just, I don't remember. So.
That's all I have, Your Honor.
I have one more question, Judge. Mr. Tracy asked you if Mr. Fry said he had a gun for sale, and I think that's a little bit out of context. In reviewing this case, did Antonio Fry say he was trying to sell the gun for someone else?
You did.
He did.
Good question. Especially, and I just want to clear this last comment you made. You just said that Mr. Fry said that he was selling that gun for somebody else.
It was a statement that he made to the CI prior to the purchase of that firearm.
Okay, there you go. So he didn't say it to you.
No.
Okay. Just want to make sure we're clear on that. You got the gun and did the trace.
Correct.
And then sometime later, you arrested Mr. Fry.
And no comment.
Okay, there were no comments then.
But the recording itself, the statements made by Mr. Fry when he see, I asked him if he had any ammo. He said, no, the guy said he couldn't get any ammo. Talking about the guy who was selling it.
Right. And what did he say about that guy? You know? No. And what did he say about when you got it?
It's,
Did say. Okay. Okay.
Thank you, sir. You may step down to the pretty guy. Call your next witness.
Detective Franz Wolf. And then, we can appoint.
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Will you please state your name
Franz Wolf.
and where are you employed?
I'm a detective with the police in Lexington.
How long have you been with the police department?
I've been employed as a police officer in Lexington for 16 years.
In June of 2014, what unit were you assigned to?
In June of 2014, I was assigned to the robbery homicide unit with the Lexington Police Department
And how long have you been in that unit?
for approximately 6 years.
At that point, or,
At that point, I guess 4 years I've been in the homicide unit.
okay, and in total, you've been in 6 years?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and then, okay. In June of 2014, were you assigned the homicide regarding Jonathan Price at Austin City?
Yes, ma'am.
Will you tell us how, in the robbery homicide unit, you get assigned a homicide?
Yes, as the detectives in the robbery homicide unit work on a rotation when it comes to being assigned a homicide here in Fayette County. Depending on how many detectives are in the unit, that determines how quickly you come up in the rotation for the next homicide. On June the 21st of 2014, I was up to be the lead investigator for the next homicide that happened in Lexington. And on that day, I was contacted by the on-call detective. There's also an on-call rotation in the homicide unit where we rotate being on-call in Lexington as the on-call robbery homicide detective for 24-hour periods at a time. So on that night of June the 21st, I was contacted by the on-call detective, which was Detective Reed Bowles, and he notified me that he had been called out to investigate a homicide, and he requested that I respond.
And when you were assigned a case, generally, kind of what steps do you take to begin your investigation?
When I'm assigned a case, I try to get as much information initially as I possibly can from the detective that's on call, in addition to the responding officers and detectives that have responded to the call and arrived before I have. Obviously, you've heard from responding officers already and have a good idea of the fact that patrol officers typically get a call when it comes into the police department, and they respond to that call and usually are the first ones on the scene, and they assess the situation. Their supervisors are present at that time, and they make a decision whether or not to contact the robbery homicide unit or the on-call detective for whatever crime has taken place. So initially, when I get called out, what I try to do is, again, collect all that, as much information as I can. And in this situation, I was notified that there were 2 victims, one that had been shot and was transported to the hospital and was suffering from a gunshot wound to the leg, and the second one had been shot and was deceased at UK Medical Center. Knowing that information, the first thing that I wanted to do was to respond to the hospital and make contact with Mrs. Price in this case, because she was a witness that could provide me with the most information about the incident at that time.
So when you were called and notified about this, where was the first place you went?
I went to the University Hospital, the University of Kentucky Medical Center.
Do you remember about what time you got there?
I arrived at the hospital at 3:01 a.m.
And what did you do when you got there?
The first thing I did is I made contact with Officer Matt Smith, who was one of the officers that works for the Bureau of Patrol, and he had responded to the scene, and then subsequently left the scene and went to the hospital with Mrs. Price. Officer Smith had had the opportunity to speak with Mrs. Price prior to my arrival at UK. And so I first met with him, and he briefed me on the situation, briefed me on the information that he had already gained. And after speaking with Officer Smith, I then went in to speak with Megan Price.
What was her demeanor when you talked with her at that time?
She was very upset, obviously. She was suffering from an injury, and she had been notified that her husband was deceased at that point in regards to the shooting. She was crying, she was upset.
And when you spoke with her, did you talk to her about what had occurred?
I did. She was, as an investigator, it was very useful information being able to have her tell me a story about what had happened, in regards to the crime that occurred, but also in regards to what led up to them being at the location in which they were at that particular time.
I want to ask you before you keep going, in talking with her about what occurred and things like that, did you also talk to her about and get descriptions from her of the individuals that were involved?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Okay. Let me ask this. Did she indicate how many people there were?
She did. She was very clear that there were 2 suspects involved.
Okay. And with respect to one of, well, I'll talk about both of them, but with respect to one of them, did she indicate, well, let me ask this. What was the description she gave you?
Mrs. Price first described the individual, the suspect that approached her and made initial contact with her. And she described that person as being a male black, having a complexion, a medium to dark colored complexion. She stated that he was wearing a white shirt and that he had shoulder-length dreadlock hairstyle, and that he was armed with a silver semi-automatic handgun.
And did she also indicate an approximate age at that time?
Yes, ma'am, she did. She stated that he ranged between the age, in her opinion, of 26 years old to 32 years old.
Did she indicate at that time whether she saw the second person with a gun?
She had very much more limited information regarding the second person. Again, that second person is not the one that she had direct contact with. But during that first interview, initial interview at the hospital, Mrs. Price stated that all she saw was a barrel of a gun regarding the second suspect.
Okay. And she did not indicate any kind of caliber or revolver versus semi-automatic or anything like that?
No more description regarding a gun other than the fact that she thought she saw a barrel of a gun.
What did you do after talking with her?
After speaking with Mrs. Price, myself, actually, while I was at the hospital, I was joined by another detective, Detective McCown, who is also in the homicide unit. And the 2 of us left the hospital and we responded to the scene and met with other members of the homicide unit in addition to the forensic services unit and responding officers.
And then what?
First, we went to the Thornton's gas station that was at the corner of New Circle Road and Woodhill Drive. And at that location, we made contact with 2 more homicide detectives, Detective Brislin and Bowles, who were actively looking through the video surveillance system at the Thornton's gas station in an effort to identify individuals that are matching the description that Mrs. Price had provided.
Then what happened?
After we were at the Thornton's gas station, again, which is completely adjacent and right in front of this crime scene, the parking lot at the Woodville Shopping Center, we went to that location where the forensic services unit was processing the crime scene. And at that point, I made contact with K-9 officer Chad Karsner. Officer Karsner had informed me that he had used his K-9 to track the suspects in the direction in which they had fled from the scene. I had earlier learned that Mrs. Price was able to give us the direction in which they had fled, and Officer Karsner's K-9 confirmed that. And that direction was towards New Circle Road, around the side of the shopping center. And so myself and the detectives that I've mentioned went to that location in an effort to search that area in a hopes to find any property that had been discarded that had previously been stolen from the victims.
And did you find anything?
No, we did not.
Do you know whether other officers had searched that area prior to you going there?
Yes, again, the Mrs. Price was able to provide that information, the direction of travel that the suspects fled, to the responding officers, and they also had been in that area looking for property too.
What did you do next?
At 7 o'clock in the morning, that's when first shift starts for the Bureau of Patrol in Lexington. So the first shift officers come to work at 7, and at that time, I made a point to be at the East Sector Roll Call Center to address them in regards to the crime that had happened, the shooting at Austin City.
What is East Sector Roll Call? What is that?
Okay, East Sector Roll Call, the city of Lexington is divided into 3 different sectors. There's a central sector, an east sector, and a west sector. And what that means is they have different places where they go to work every day. East sector has one building, central sector has one building, and west sector has one building. So the Woodhill Shopping Center, so the city's divided into 3 different sections, and those officers that are, say, in east sector are responsible for answering the calls for service in that part of town in which they work. So the Woodhill Shopping Center is in the east sector in Lexington. And so in an effort to pass the information on about the homicide investigation that was being conducted and to ask for their assistance in the investigation, I wanted to go and address the first shift officers when they were coming on duty that day.
So when officers on first shift are coming on duty in East Sector, they all meet up at a particular, I guess, East Sector station?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And then are they then dispatched in their respective cars?
Yes, ma'am, they are. So the sector is then divided up into smaller beats, and officers are assigned a beat within the sector. And so yes, after they all meet there at 7 a.m., they have a roll call meeting where their supervisors conduct some administrative duties for the day, and then after that meeting is over, then they leave the roll call center to answer the calls for service in the area in which they're assigned that day.
So when you went to that East Sector roll call, what were you wanting to do?
Well, again, this was a unique investigation in the very beginning because I was able to talk to Megan Price, and Megan Price was able to provide me somewhat of a vague description, but of one of the suspects that was involved in the case. So my primary objective was to make contact with these officers and pass this information on. At that time, the description of a male black with a medium to dark complexion, 26 to 32 years of age, wearing or having shoulder-length dreadlocks, I wanted to pass that information on to them and explain to them that we are, looking for people matching that description. Not that that description, everybody with that description has committed a crime, but at that point, I'm in the process of casting a wide net and gathering a lot of information. So I was interested in identifying individuals specifically, or starting at least, in the Wood Hill area that match that description. So if their names come up in the future, or there's a piece of evidence that supports them maybe further being involved in a crime, then of course we would pursue that.
Okay. And was your goal only to look for people who match that description who might have been involved in that crime?
No. So as I explained, these officers work a specific part of town pretty much every day. The way that the patrol function works the best is having the same officers work the same neighborhoods every day that they work. The reason why is they get out in the neighborhood, they meet people, they know people that live in the neighborhood, those people begin to know the officers, and then those people, when situations come up in the neighborhood that maybe they wouldn't feel comfortable telling the police about, now they know an officer in that neighborhood and feel more comfortable going to them and providing information. So kind of the second fold of going to East Sector roll call, the reasoning was to tell them to put their feelers out to people in the community to try to find people that have information, kind of proactively work the neighborhood in an effort to find information about the crime that was being investigated.
And why East Sector? Why just East Sector?
Well, East Sector made the most sense on the morning of June the 21st, simply because that's where this crime happened. It happened in the Wood Hill Shopping Center, which is in East Sector, and the East Sector, the Wood Hill neighborhood that surrounds the shopping center would be a place where officers could go and attempt to find information.
Did each shift have a roll call?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And did you go to each shift giving that information?
What I did was I contacted the supervisors for the subsequent second and third shifts, in addition to the supervisor of the clear unit, which is another unit that doesn't necessarily work a specific beat in Lexington or in that sector, but they kind of go to areas of town where they're having specific problems, and they work a kind of a patrol function, but more as a proactive patrolling instead of a reactive patrolling of answering calls for service. So I contacted those supervisors, and I passed the information on to them, and I requested that they disseminate that to the individuals or the officers that worked for them as they came on duty in second and third shifts.
And you said one of the reasons that you went there, you wanted the officers kind of collect feelers in the neighborhood to see if information comes in. Do you get tips in homicide investigations?
Yes, we do get tips from time to time. We get tips in different forms. Sometimes people will call tips in. If they call the general number to the police department, which is how most people would contact the police, you would get a dispatcher on the other end of the line, and those dispatchers are trained to document tips to crimes as they come in at that level. There's actually a form that they can fill out with the information that the caller provides, and then they can pass that tip on to the appropriate person.
Okay. And are all tips that come in good tips or valid tips?
No, unfortunately they're not. Not that the person that's calling in is trying to provide a poor tip, but obviously some people's information are not as credible or not important, but maybe aren't as good at tips as others.
And so what do you do in a case where you get tips? What do you do as an investigator?
As an investigator, when I get a tip, what I'm going to do first is, well, obviously read the tip and digest the information that's in the tip. If there's a name that's associated with the tip as a potential suspect, do a brief background on that person. Maybe get a photograph of the individual that is included in the tip. A lot of the times, the intelligence unit at the police department can assist with that. They have databases where they can get information about people. And that would be one avenue to take if someone calls in the police department and provides just a narrow scope of information about an individual. And then once I get that information, I determine if there's any evidence so far in the investigation to support the tip that's come in. And if there is, of course, proceed with that information. And if not, what I would do is I'd maintain that information in my case file in the event that as the ongoing investigation takes place, if evidence or information comes in to support that tip, I would be able to move forward with it at that point.
And do you immediately go out and talk to or interview every name that comes in on a tip?
No. As an investigator, we don't like to go talk to somebody until we have some information to support the conversation that we're going to have with somebody. We would like to essentially know if someone's involved in a crime, or because what we need to do is either be able to prove or disprove a story that someone tells us. If I have no information about an individual and I go out and have a conversation with that individual, I have no choice but to believe what that individual tells me unless I have evidence or information to disprove or prove what they're telling me.
So you talked about going to the roll call, the 7 o'clock East Sector roll call. What did you do after that?
At 9:30 in the morning, Detective McCown and Detective Bowles and I left to go back to the University Medical Center for the purpose, actually for two reasons, both revolving around Mrs. Price. I wanted to collect Mrs. Price's clothing that she was wearing that night from the hospital, because earlier in the conversation, the first conversation that I had with her, she indicated that, again, the suspect with the shoulder-length dreads that approached her had demanded her money and her purse, and actually took the purse off of her shoulder and from around her neck and shoulder. So at that point, I wanted to collect her clothing in the event, and maintain it as evidence in the event that there was forensic evidence left on her clothing from the suspect. The second reason is simply to get another follow-up interview with her. A few hours had passed. Obviously, the first time that I spoke with her, she was very distraught. And a second follow-up interview in a situation like this is a lot of the time very important, because a victim can remember additional things as time goes on.
Let me go back and ask you about collecting her clothes. You collected, was she wearing those clothes when you collected them?
She was not. She obviously had been treated by the emergency department staff, and her clothing at that point was placed in a plastic bag, as it typically is when we arrived at the hospital. So I took that clothing in that plastic bag that it was in.
And then what did you ultimately do with those clothes?
Ultimately, I returned back to the police department where I repackaged that clothing appropriately for as we package clothing as evidence. We don't package clothing in plastic bags simply because it can hold moisture in and it's going to be sitting for a long period of time. And so I removed the clothing from the plastic bag, placed it in a paper bag as we do, and then I included the plastic bag that they were initially in from the hospital in the paper bag and sealed it up and provided it to the forensic services unit.
When you talked to Ms. Price the second time, do you recall her demeanor at that point? You said that was about 9:30 in the morning on the same day?
It was, obviously, she's still very upset. However, able to have a coherent conversation and a intelligent conversation, a very useful conversation with me and as being the investigator.
With respect to the descriptions of suspects that she gave, did she give any additional information with respect to a firearm for the second suspect?
For the second suspect, she didn't describe a firearm any further. During that conversation I had with Mrs. Price, she did say that the second suspect had a gun, but didn't provide any further description of a gun.
And then was she able to give any information with respect to complexions on either?
Yes, we asked her about the complexion of the two suspects. Again, to recap on the first suspect, she had indicated that the first suspect was medium to dark complected. The way that she described that is that on the second conversation I had with Mrs. Price, she said that the first suspect was not as dark as the second suspect, indicating that the second suspect was darker complected than the first. And she went on to state that the second suspect was either really dark complected, or she made the comment that he was either really dark complected or wearing a mask, indicating to me that it was a dark complected individual.
What did you do after talking to her at the hospital?
After we left the hospital, Detective McCown and Bowles and I returned to the area of the scene, the Woodhill Shopping Center, this time primarily for the purpose of attempting to preserve any type of video evidence that was available in the area, in the immediate area of Woodhill Shopping Center. And we first went to the Woodhill Food Mart, which is a convenience store that's in a building that's next to Austin City, in addition to the Danny Scott Liquor Store, which is in the same building as the Woodhill Food Mart. At that location, we made contact with the owner of the Food Mart, who indicated to us that there was video surveillance systems at both the Food Mart and at the liquor store, the Danny Scott Liquor Store. He indicated that he wasn't real sure how to operate the systems, but they had a custodian of video that installed the systems and maintained the systems for them.
And who was that person?
That person was Brian Maxwell.
Okay. Did you receive video at that point from those two locations?
No, we didn't. Actually, the owner of the Food Mart, we provided him with our contact information and the times in which we were interested in getting the video clip from, and he passed the information on and initially had Brian Maxwell recontact us.
Did you obtain camera from anywhere else at that time?
Yes, after leaving the building that contains the Food Mart and the liquor store, we made contact with the owners of the Mariana's Tienda store, which is a business that is actually in the Woodhill Shopping Center. And earlier in the night, when we first responded to the scene, we had noticed that there were exterior video cameras on the building in the area of that business. So, of course, at 10:47 when we arrived, or that thereabouts at the Mariana Tienda, their business was open at that point. We made contact with the owner, and the owner provided us access to his camera system.
Did you watch that video there?
We did. We watched that there and realized while we were there that there was video surveillance that had been captured on his system that was very relevant to the case that we were investigating.
And did you collect that video at that point?
I did not. At 12:08, I contacted Detective Barber, who is a detective with the Lexington Police. I believe that you've heard from Detective Barber. He works for the Computer Forensic Services. And I requested that he respond to Mariana Tienda for the purpose of collecting that video.
And why him? Why him?
I requested Detective Barber because he's very familiar with downloading video from various different types of DVRs or recording devices. He's been to training to do this. He's been to schools to do this. In an effort to appropriately preserve that video, I requested him to do it just so it got done properly.
What did you do after that?
After that, after that is actually when we went to go return the clothing to FSU. And when we did that we turned that into FSU Detective Luke Young. And Detective Young had in his possession Jonathan Price's wedding band, which he had been provided for the purpose of swabbing that wedding band for potential DNA. So when we booked in or provided Megan Price's clothing to the Forensic Services Unit, he provided us with that wedding band. So we returned that wedding band to Mrs. Price that day at 1:05 in the afternoon.
Had Jonathan Price's clothes been collected as well?
Yes. Detective Young had been to the hospital earlier in the evening, or earlier that morning, and collected Jonathan Price's clothing.
You indicated that you returned Jonathan's wedding ring back to Megan at 1:05?
Correct.
Okay. And where did you meet her to give that back to her?
At the hospital.
Okay. And did you do something else there at the hospital other than give her the ring back?
I don't believe so.
Okay. So then what did you do next?
The next thing that we did in this investigation is on the 23rd of June, I met with Megan Price for the third time at her mother's house outside of Lexington. The reason for doing that was to collect buccal swabs from Mrs. Price. Buccal swabs are cotton swabs that we put in the inside of a person's mouth for the purpose of collecting a DNA standard from a victim to be compared to potential evidence in a case.
And that's what you were doing when you went to go meet with her on the 23rd?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And did you in fact do that?
Yes, I did.
Did you also talk to her again about the suspect?
We did. She was able to provide us with some more information. I mean, we had a general conversation with her, and during that conversation, we spoke about the suspects in this case.
Okay. Did she indicate which of the two shot her?
She did. She was very adamant still, as she had been from the beginning, that the suspect in the white shirt with the shoulder-length dreads had shot her.
Okay. And then did she indicate who she thought shot Jonathan?
During that meeting, stated that Jonathan was shot by the second suspect wearing the dark-colored shirt.
And was she able to give any description with respect to the gun for the second suspect?
No. Again, she said during that conversation, she stated that both of the suspects were armed, but no type of description or further description was provided about a gun on that meeting.
What did you do after talking with her on the 23rd?
Well, one more piece of information that she provided, she gave us a better description of the purse and wallet that were stolen during the robbery during that meeting. She described the purse as being an over-the-shoulder bag that was teal or turquoise in color, and she stated that Jonathan's wallet that was stolen was just a brown leather wallet with a United States Marine Corps emblem on it.
Okay. And to your knowledge, did either of these items ever get recovered?
No, ma'am.
Tell us what you did next.
Okay. The following day, on the 24th of June, 2014, one piece of information that we got was a report regarding the credit cards that were in Mrs. Price's purse and that were stolen during this incident. We got a report that there had been no activity on the credit cards after they'd been stolen, and that the last charge was at Perry's restaurant here in town, which Mrs. Price confirmed that was where her and Jonathan had dinner that evening before the shooting. Also on the 24th of June, Detective McCown and I went to the Kentucky State Police Lab in Frankfort for the purpose of dropping off the projectile that was recovered from Jonathan Price at the autopsy, and the cartridge casing or shell casing that was collected at Austin City on the parking lot the night of the incident, the night of the murder.
Were you given any information with respect to that casing or projectile in terms of the type of gun it could potentially be?
Yes, later on in the day, Lawrence Pilcher is a firearms examiner in the Kentucky State Police Laboratory, and he reported to us that the cartridge casing that was collected on the parking lot at Austin City had a very unique hammer impression on the front.
Detective Wolf, we're not going to talk specifically about what Mr. Pilcher told you, but in that conversation with Mr. Pilcher, were you given information about what type of gun that you should be looking for based on the projectile and the casing that you submitted?
Yes, I was.
Okay, and what kind of gun were you told to be looking for?
A .45 caliber Springfield Model XVS handgun.
Okay. And then based on that information, did someone from the police department do some research or some investigation on Springfield XVS and reports taken?
Yes, ma'am. When we were notified of what type of gun we were looking for, we were able to do a query of that type of gun, and we learned that that type of gun, the make, manufacturer, model, and caliber, had been stolen on June the 15th, which would have been 6 days before the murder.
Okay. After doing that, let me ask this, let me go forward a little bit. This would have all been on the 24th, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. What did you do then on the 27th?
On the 27th, I contacted Detective Barber again with the computer forensics unit, and I asked Detective Barber to go out into the neighborhood, the Wood Hill neighborhood, for the purpose of collecting any video that he could find. And again, I know that sounds like casting a very wide net, but the fact is, in an investigation like this, video evidence can be very important. And in my experience, I know that video evidence isn't something that stays around forever, especially on home video systems, so on, and even commercial systems. A lot of the time, depending on the system, the video records over itself, and then the footage is no longer available. So I asked Detective Barber to go out to canvass the area and to look for any video systems or houses, businesses with video systems, and attempt to get the footage from the time surrounding the homicide downloaded, in the event that we would need that in the future.
And at some point, did you review the video evidence, or I won't call it evidence, but the videos that he that he collected and submitted?
I did, yes.
Okay. And was there anything of value to you in your investigation on any of those videos?
There was not. He was able to get video from a couple residences and 2 businesses in the area, all of which were significant distance away from the crime scene. And those videos were reviewed and ended up being of no evidentiary value.
What did you do then?
On June the 30th, Detective McCown and I had scheduled, we've been in contact with Megan Price throughout this investigation so far, but we had scheduled a meeting with Megan Price again at her mother's house, really for a family meeting. It was Megan, it was her mother, and it was also Jonathan's mother that were to be present during that meeting.
And what was the point of that meeting?
Again, the point of the meeting was to have a family meeting and answer any other questions. But during that meeting, she provided some more information regarding the suspects in the case.
Did she indicate again who shot her,
Yes.
and who was that?
If that remained consistent, she stated that the initial described suspect, the one with the shoulder-length dreads with the white shirt, had shot her.
And was she sure at that point whether both had guns?
Now, during that conversation with Mrs. Price on the 30th, she wanted to tell us that she was not certain if both of the suspects were armed at that time, the time of the shooting.
Did anything else happen on the 30th?
Well, in regards to the robbery at the Quality Inn, again, we had discovered that a Springfield .45 caliber Model XDS pistol had been stolen during that robbery, and Detective Upchurch was able to make contact with the victim, the owner of that gun, on that date, and was able to obtain the serial number for the gun.
What did you do after that?
On July the 2nd, I went to the Kentucky State Police Lab. I had received a request from the lab to provide head hair samples from Mrs. Price, and also for Jonathan Price. And again, as I described earlier, the process of collecting a buccal swab from a victim as a standard to be compared to evidence, they had requested head hair samples from both victims for the same purposes.
And did anything else happen on the 2nd?
Yes, Officer Gary Thurman, at that time, he was assigned or assisting in this investigation in the homicide office, and he was assigned to review the video that had been collected from the Thornton's gas station on Woodhill Drive.
And what were you looking for in the Thornton's video?
Again, at this point, we were looking kind of like we were looking when I went to go speak with the officers at roll call, we were looking for individuals that matched the description that had been provided by Megan Price.
And then if there were individuals that matched that description, what was the plan?
Well, again, simply having this description doesn't mean anybody's committed a crime. However, at that point, the suspects in this case haven't been identified. So we were going with the information that we had been provided from Mrs. Price, and essentially it's accumulating data at that point in the event that we may need it in the future.
And then, what happened after that? I think you did something on the 10th?
Yes, on the 10th, I had contacted the print shop at the police department, and I had them print out some door hangers with information regarding the murder of Jonathan Price. And those door hangers were disseminated to the Clear unit, and they went out into the Woodhill neighborhood and hung these door hangers on everyone's door in an effort to generate information in the case.
And what information was contained on those door hangers?
It had a photograph of Jonathan Price. It had Jonathan Price's name and a brief description. It stated, shot in the parking lot of Austin City, Woodhill Shopping Center on 6/21/14 around 1:30 a.m. And then at the bottom it has a box. It says wanted, 2 suspects, male black with shoulder-length dreads, and then number 2, male black. And then it has information regarding Crime Stoppers tips and cash reward information for information in the case.
In an investigation, as you're gathering evidence, you're gathering facts or whatever, do you disseminate all the information that you know?
No, we do not.
Why not?
Again, I touched on this briefly earlier. When as an investigator, when we go out and to interview someone, we don't want that person to have all the information that we know. And the reason for that is we're going to listen to a story that that person's going to tell us, and based on what is in that story, we need to decipher whether or not that person's being truthful or not. Simply, like I described it earlier, if we didn't know anything about the person that we were interviewing, we wouldn't know if they were being truthful or not. Well, if the person that we're interviewing knows everything we know, then we wouldn't know that they were being truthful or not. So little pieces of information would be released, and then in the conversation you'd be able to tell if the person has additional information regarding the case.
Then on the 17th, did you receive information that caused you to then look into Mr. Canada and Mr. Malone?
Yes, on that date I received information that caused us to look at the 2 defendants that are here today as suspects in the murder of Jonathan Price.
And what did you do? Did you begin researching them?
Sure. Once we received that information, like I described earlier that we do when we get a tip, we start researching that individual or individuals in this case in an attempt to learn about them and get any information that we can on them.
Okay. And did you learn where Mr. Canada lived?
Yes, at that point during that initial investigation into Mr. Canada, we got an address that I believe was his at that point in time.
Okay, and do you know generally where that was?
Yes, it's in the 400 block of Patchen Drive here in Lexington.
Was he there when you went to go, did you attempt to go talk to him on the 24th?
I did, and he was not there.
Did you also get information about where Mr. Malone may have been living?
Yes,
Okay, and where was that?
That was at 461 Breckenridge Street here in Lexington
And did you also attempt to talk to him on that day?
on the 24th. Yes, ma'am.
And was he there?
He was not.
Did you speak to someone who was, I guess, trying to make contact with Mr. Malazan for you? I'm not sure what that says, but did you speak to someone who was attempting to make contact for you with him?
Yes, well, when we went to the address in an effort to make contact with defendant Malazan, there was someone that was present. He was not there, but we made contact with an individual who knew Mr. Malazan and placed a telephone call to Mr. Malazan while we were at the house.
Okay. And did Mr. Malazan come and talk with you?
He did not. We requested that this individual tell Mr. Malazan that we would like to talk with him, but he did not.
Okay. And were you given a number that would belong to Mr. Malazan?
Yes, the number in which this individual on Breckenridge Street contacted Mr. Malazan on the 24th of July was 859-552-7517.
What did you do next?
The following day, the 25th of July, was the day that Dorothy Lesage, who is an apartment manager on Village Drive, contacted the police in reference to some suspicious behavior that she had observed regarding defendant Malazan's wife, Shalonda Malazan.
Okay. And I'm not, again, going to ask you what she said, but did you become aware that Ms. Malazan may have put a hat in a trash can?
Yes, I was.
Okay. After that, I think we're up to maybe a couple of days later on July the 29th. What happens at that point?
Several things happened on the 29th of July. First of all, Detective Upchurch and Detective Schoonover on that day had traveled to Burnside or the Somerset area for the purpose of making contact with the victims in the Quality Inn robbery. And during that meeting with those victims,
May we approach